Hello and welcome to AXSChat. This week we're virtually traveling to Colombia. Well, at least our guest is in Colombia. I'm still in the UK, Antonio's in Ireland, and Deborah's in Virginia. Welcome to Juan Pablo Salazar. It's great to have you with us. It's always interesting to hear about what's going on in other parts of the world, particularly the non-Anglophile parts of the world, because we do focus rather too much on the English-speaking world when it comes to accessibility. So welcome, Juan. It's great to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be working in this field of work?
Sure, Neil, and hello to everyone. I feel very honored to be in this group, so thanks a lot for the invitation. Well, yeah, my background is in advertising. I majored in that, and I worked as a creative writer on different agencies, and that's like my forte is like on communications. After I acquired a disability 14 years ago in a boating accident, through the rehabilitation process, I got like engaged on the movement. And it meant a lot to me to understand that how this was like more than a personal and family drama. This came down to a civil rights movement. So that was very powerful for me. So I got engaged and started an NGO that promoted rights. And there it was like a learning curve. We learned that the UN Convention existed, and we started to advocate on all of this. And well, yeah, 14 years later, well, you know how this works. It's a movement. So I've worn different hats, and I've done my activism on this movement from different sectors. And currently, I advise President Santos on disability policy for the Colombian state, for the Colombian government.
And thank you. And we know that Colombia is a pretty forward-thinking country, in that it's one of the first I've come across that's gone and purchased national licenses for things like screen readers.
Yes.
Did you play a role in that?
No, this was before I was government. I was back in the NGO when they did the negotiation to buy these licenses for the softwares for screen reading. And yeah, I think it's a couple 100,000 licenses free of charge for people with visual disabilities to download and use. So yes, this is one of the things we're proud of. I think that in technologies and communications in general, there's a lot of field where we are able to innovate and do cool stuff. So we're particularly proud of that one. And the reliefs, I wouldn't know how to translate it. Centro de Relevo, which is like relief center, which means deaf people can call using the smartphone. And for example, they go to the doctor or to the lawyer or somewhere they want to keep the conversation private, and they get an interpreter live on the smartphone. This is free of charge. And the Minister of Telecommunications and Technology provides these services. So yeah, on that field, we're particularly proud of our advances.
That sounds interesting. I know Deborah's got a question, but I just want to follow up on what you just said. So the smartphone service, is that for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, or for people with visual impairments?
No, for people deaf and hard of hearing.
Okay.
You get an interpreter.
Sign language.
Yeah.
Great. Deborah?
Well, welcome to the program, Juan. We've been really looking forward to having you on the program, and we want to do a couple of shout outs. I want to thank Ricardo Garcia, who is with Georgia Tech, the AMAC Center. We actually featured the executive director, Dr. Christopher Lee, last week. So I know that Ricardo had recommended that we interview you because you impressed him so much. So shout out to Ricardo. Also, we mentioned before we started the interview, Dr. Paola, who we interviewed from the University del Norte, and she's an amazing woman doing really powerful things in Costa Rica. I mean, in Colombia, sorry. The reason why Costa Rica was in my head, because I have a colleague in Costa Rica, David Perez. And one thing that I've said to David is it's very important for the Spanish speakers of the world to really have their own voices, as opposed to just, because I often see with countries that like Colombia or Costa Rica or others, they often assume that the more developed countries like the United States have all the answers. And I'm invited to speak at different places, which I certainly appreciate. But the reality is we're seeing a lot of innovation coming from the smaller countries, the smaller developing countries. And so I think that's very exciting. And that's one reason why we're very grateful to Barclays Bank for being one of our supporters, so we can make sure that we're having these global conversations and so that we can learn from each other. So I'm very excited about that. And really, we were very intrigued about what you were doing and how you made this mission something that once life decided you were going to go down this one path after the boating accident, that you said, this is our mission. We're going to make sure that we're including everyone with disabilities in Colombia. But tell us a little bit more about what you're doing. So we know you're supporting, the government's supporting people that are deaf and other people with disabilities in Colombia, but give us some other, tell us more about what you're doing and also about the NGO that you created.
Okay, well, my job is, I chair the National Council on Disabilities. This is an instance where all the ministries have a place. So all of them, including like environment, mines, culture, you know, stuff that you wouldn't link directly to disabilities. Well, culture, yes, but I don't know, mining or the others are tough. So we have like representatives, directive level people from all the ministries and all the entities, and civil society represented by each disability. So in these panels, in these meetings that we have every 2 months, what we do is see how we can implement the CR. So that's the main thing. Also includes a legislative agenda, so passing bills and fixing bills, so we comply with the CRPD. We also do monitoring, so in that National Council, make sure that we are actually doing what we said we were going to do. And then I have also a projects agenda where we can do like communication strategies, laboral initiatives, and like more particular stuff, as opposed to general stuff that we do from the legislative agenda. Yeah, my job, I'd say it's like a coordination instance where I can make sure the entire Colombian government is articulated and working together in a network that is coherent with the values of the CRPD and interacting with the civil society and seeing what their needs are.
Well, and that's a perfect example of something that Colombia is doing that the United States hasn't done. The United States, like many, many countries, has signed the CRPD, and I'm very proud to work a lot with the United Nations, especially with the International Labor Organization, but the United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And someday I hope we will, but we actually, this big United States can actually learn from the work that's being done in Colombia. So thank you for your work, Juan. But I'm going to pass the microphone over to Antonio.
Thank you, Deborah. One of the things that we see frequently is sometimes difficulties in having organizations working with disabilities to collaborate with each other and to act together to defend their own interests. Can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to bring them all to the table and what challenges and things you were able to find through the way in order to make that collaboration with them work in the organization that you are representing, supporting the government of Colombia?
You mean like the interaction between civil society and government?
yes, and the organizations supporting people with disabilities?
Well, it's tough. I'd say that like any social collective, like any civil rights movement, there's a lot of friction within the civil society. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges and maybe our most important threats, meaning that the NGOs, the different factions of the civil society are like fighting with each other or fighting with the government as opposed to be working together. And so it's always a challenge, although this is politics all over, and I'd say like also in the ethnical minorities and all the, or on the LGBT movements, it's the same thing, at least in my country, and what I've said in other countries as well. It's always a challenge. What we try to do for the government is like create the way to do this, like give society a proper way, proper conduct of communication and interaction. The government, nevertheless, the CRPD, and when the country presents the report, we have the shadow reports. And some of the shadow reports are friendly, some are not so friendly, some are fair, some are not fair at all. With all. So in this instance that I shared, that I told you about, the National Council of Disabilities, we have representatives from civil society, from people with visual disabilities, audio, physical, and so on and so forth. And they're supposed to be representatives of all of their communities. That, of course, sounds great on paper, but it doesn't really translate as efficient as we would like to. Nevertheless, these are the rules of democracy, so we are supposed as a government to be able to answer to both friendly advices and not so friendly criticisms, which are also welcome. My line is on respect. Well, if I feel that I'm being criticized with respect, I'm always open to a dialogue. Sometimes it doesn't even happen. Sometimes it's very harsh and unfair criticisms. And well, I think that's part of the job also, is to be an object of catharsis for the civil society. So I'm cool with that, and I know it's part of the job.
I just put myself on mute. That was very clever of me. Okay, so it's really gratifying to see that there's such a structured approach to taking the agenda forwards. And as Deborah says, not all of the global north has taken such an approach. So what would your advice be to countries that are wanting to bring people together? How best to go about setting up the role? Are there key things that you require in order to be successful in managing the stakeholders and that bridge between civil society and government? Are there certain things that you could possibly get away with not doing to begin with, as you know, because obviously expediency is you want to get stuff done. So what are your key priorities for, or what would you advise would be key priorities for countries that want to start down the road of creating a role to take this forward?
I'd say there's two things to keep in mind. First is create this structure legally, meaning that you have some decree, some executive order, or some law, some bill that creates the system. Like we have it in Colombia, we have that national council, but then we have provincial councils, and then we have municipal councils. This entire structure is called the National System on Disabilities, because it's supposed to be all connected. Again, it sounds great on paper. It doesn't work as great on reality, but at least we have a bill that creates the system. and information is supposed to flow top down and down up. So that's the first advice I give, just to create the structure and to make sure you have civil society participation in all instances of this structure. The second advice I give is create sub-levels of this structure that tackle specific subjects. So if, for example, you're gonna implement Article 12, which is such a big challenge, legal capacity of persons with disabilities, what you do is you create a workshop on that. And it has worked great for us. So you bring the specialized stakeholders, like universities, the Ministry of Justice, the defense of the civil society, some key NGOs that are like experts on this, and you sit them down to work together for a specific objective, which in this example is coming up with bill projects for legal capacity for Article 12. So when you have a clear objective, you can narrow down your stakeholders and you can actually get stuff done, because you have, you narrow down the objective as opposed to just sitting down to discuss whatever, because those kind of town hall meetings, well, it's important for civil society to have like that space for catharsis, but I wouldn't say those are the places where you get stuff done.
That's very true.
Yeah, I agree. And I also have found, I know that when I was supporting Egypt, the government of Egypt, and they've done some amazing things, there was a real conflict between the government and the DPOs, the disability persons organizations. And often the people with disabilities were fighting so hard for their rights. It's happening right now all over the world, but we've recently had people with disabilities that were advocating for themselves arrested in the United States, trying to fight for their rights. And so it becomes such a conflict back and forth. And after a while, as you so eloquently noted, you know, we're not getting anything done. We're just fighting with each other, which all you have to do is look in the United States to see an example of that right now. And so I think it's really important that you're really focusing to make sure the right stakeholders are included in the conversation, that they're heard, that you're really looking at what do you need to do in Colombia to truly implement the CRPD so that it is actually successful for the people of Colombia. And we as the world watch you. We watch what you're doing, Juan, and we say, all right, what can we learn about what's happening in Colombia? Well, what do you mean all this innovation is happening in Colombia? I thought it was all happening in other countries. And so I think making, as a matter of fact, one of the groups that I've worked with as an advisor, G3ICT, which is an international NGO focused on this, they actually created training that they provided to disability persons organizations all over the world, helping them understand how they could have conversations with governments and other people in power so they could be heard, instead of sometimes what I think corporations think in the United States is no matter what we do to include people with disabilities, it's never enough. You're always going to attack us. So it becomes a us and them situation. So I really applaud the efforts that you're making in Colombia to have all voices heard, but at the same time, realistically understand we have to make progress. Mm-hmm. We have to make step-by-step progress. I would also say, Juan, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to pass it back to Antonio because he has a question. But when you talk about the Article 12, do you mind, for people that aren't familiar with the CRPD, if you could just talk just for a moment a little bit more about what Article 12 does?
Well, the spirit of Article 12 is changing the figure of interdiction, and I think that's the right word, to a system where people can make decisions with support from the government. So interdiction, what it means, and this is a 2,000-year-old culture, this comes from Roman law. It means that a person with a psychosocial or an intellectual disability gives their civil life actually to a tutor, to a mentor. So their mom or their sister or their brother would take charge of their legal capacity to protect their patrimony, their money. And in that tube, all of the other rights go as well. So these people can't sign a contract, can't have a banking account, can't vote, can't get married, and this is terrible. So what Article 12 tries to do is to change this and give legal capacity by supporting these people with different types of support. So for example, a person with schizophrenia, they're not in crisis all the time. They only have crises sometimes. So what they do when they don't have the crisis is they set up some standards. They say, when I get the crisis, please give me this drug and not this other drug. Take me to this hospital and not to this other hospital. Call my brother and don't call my mother, and so on and so forth, so that when the crisis comes, they don't get forced, institutionalized, given drugs that they don't want, and all the rights are over. So what we try to do by also watching great models from all over the world is see how the Colombian version of this is gonna happen. We just presented this bill in Congress. It needs our system is bicameral, so we have a Senate and a House of Representatives. It has to go on through 2 debates on each of these chambers before it becomes a bill. So we just presented it like a couple of weeks ago. We're waiting for the first debate. So yeah, the timeline on this is like a year. So I hope that on a year from now, we actually have this legal capacity system for Colombia. We've been working regionally on this. We had a great consulting from Inclusion International. Michael Back from Canada came over to Colombia, and he sat down in this workshop that was led by the Ministry of Justice and the Andes University. And we worked almost a year and a half on putting together the proposal. Again, watching what the Canadians were doing, what the Bulgarians were doing, what the Irish were doing, what the Peruvians were doing. And by watching all of this, we came up with our own model that I hope becomes a reality at least, hopefully a little bit less than a year from now.
Fantastic. Antonio, I know you still got a question or a comment that you wanted to get in.
Yes, no, considering that we have been talking about a structure in society that allows different levels of representations in relation to people with disabilities, I would like to know, if you go back, what type of impact are you able to observe in the Colombian society in relation to the way how people with disabilities are integrated? It could be how they get a job, how they are represented in the media. Can you give us a little bit about the impact of all this work in the Colombian society?
Well, that's the toughest question, because what the CRPD wants to do is shift a culture. And this is tough to measure. Again, let's look at other civil rights movements. Let's look, how can we measure if women are more included or less included in societies? Yeah, you can get some indicators like wages or number of parliamentaries that are women, number of women that are getting graduated from universities, stuff like that. So we in the disability movement could do the same. Yeah, see, okay, how many people with disabilities are getting professional degrees, how many people with disabilities are in Congress or in political representations. It's tough to measure, yeah, because the discrimination it's something in the culture, in the hearts and in the minds of people. But what I can tell you is that by creating this structure and by starting to address this issue as a human rights issue, we're starting to position it as that, as opposed to a health problem or a charity kind of deal, which I think is the hugest stigma in Latin America, is that we are seen more like the punished of God or some type of objects of charity as opposed of subjects with rights. So yeah, that's the biggest challenge. How to measure it, my friend, that's the toughest. That's the toughest. But we see that there are different issues that we can tackle. So how's the inclusive education doing? How is the laboral initiatives doing? How are the participations of people with disabilities in culture, in sports, stuff like that? So yeah, you can measure those indicators. The fact that the Colombian Paralympic Committee is doing so great in the last cycles means that there are other things happening in the country that make this possible. Yeah, but at the end, it's tough to measure.
That's really interesting. One of the things I'm very interested in finding out a bit more about is the fact that quite often in countries you'll see it's difficult for people with disabilities to get jobs because they're not got the education and the qualifications that they need in order to get the job. So obviously a focus on education's important. Are you also, as well as educating people with disabilities, are you also looking to educate other people around accessibility and assistive technologies and what those means, so that we're creating, or you'll be creating an environment where people understand not just the rights, but the technical implementations to enable people to be included?
Yes, we're working on including accessibility education in all faculties, especially in architecture and engineering faculties. We're trying to make courses on accessibility mandatory. We are on it, but I think the first step is to get people with disabilities in regular schools. And this is an executive order that I'm hoping to launch this week. So we're particularly, yes, with our fingers crossed, waiting for it to happen. I was Saturday working on a video where we're gonna do the promotion on this executive order, because I think it's not even about passing these bills, which are of course a very important first step, but the way you make the learning of the values of these bills and executives order are more important than the bills themselves. Yeah, you need the way you socialize, the way you advertise, the way you implement these are super important. So we put together a very cool video that I'm gonna make sure I share with you guys when it's done. We were shooting Saturday, and it's a very cool initiative. So I'm gonna share it with you guys by the end of the week, I hope.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating learning about all of the work you're doing. It's particularly gratifying to hear the things you've just said about embedding it in the education culture. Just need to say a thank you to our supporters, Barclays, who are helping us keep the lights on and continue to keep AXSChat sustainable. Looking forward to you joining us tomorrow night on Twitter. Thank you once again, Juan Pablo Salazar.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Antonio. It was my pleasure. And looking forward to see you guys again tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
You.
Thank you.